Our keynote speaker is Professor Juan Aprin, and is an assistant professor at the School of Publishing and associate director of research of the Public Knowledge Project, and then is a co-director of Scholarly Communication Lab at Simon Fraser University, British Columbia, Canada. And I will be talking about the most innovative methods are sometimes the simplest. Professor Aprin, you have the floor.
Great. Hello. Good morning, or for me, good midday for probably most of you, or good afternoon. So thank you very much for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. Before I begin, I want to just acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'm incredibly fortunate to have an opportunity to live, work, and increasingly take in the beauty of these lands on which I am an uninvited guest. I want to continue then by way of introduction to tell you that it's a real treat to have an opportunity to speak to this sort of distinguished group of library and information science students. You probably don't know this, but although my work sort of intersects a lot with the world of information science more than any other discipline, as Phillips just kindly said, I work in a publishing studies program in a School of Publishing, which offers a Master's of Publishing degree oriented towards primarily publishing professionals, most people interested in doing book and magazine, trade publishing. And so I kind of have very few opportunities to address the groups of graduate students who might, I hope, have some interest in the kinds of things that I do for my research. While Master's of Publishing students sort of get a very different side of me. They hear me talk about publishing technologies, about the web, about how content industries intersect with both of those things. And while there are some graduate students in the Scholarly Communications Lab that I co-direct, and actually I think a couple of them might be among the audience here today, so hi to fellow ScholComm Lab members. It's really not quite the same as having the thrill of being able to address a crowd of folks interested in information, of students interested in library and information science. And so when I accepted to give this keynote, this invitation to speak, I decided to use it to get out of my system some of the kind of the story and some of the advice that I would maybe have the opportunity to do more regularly if I was standing in front of in classes or having groups of students from this field, if I was teaching at, say, any of the universities that you're all at. And so while the title of my talk is The Most Innovative Methods Are Sometimes the Simplest, I admit that, that I sort of, use that as an opportunity to say, it's not that it's always true that they're always the simplest. And sometimes you do need more complicated things. But I wanted to, I use sort of the more clickbaity title to draw you in and make sure that you stuck around, even though we are going. I know that you've been at this now for several hours, and you're probably ready for that lunch break. And so I think underneath what will be a somewhat sort of lighthearted, not very. I'm not going to get into the weeds, methodological weeds, as they say. I do want to say that undergirding this talk around how to think about research questions and methods, that there are some kind of real serious issues that plague academia. And I think that I'd be happy to take questions about some of those things, because some of the issues around that plague academia are the things that are at the heart of my own research and the work that I do. And so, each of these issues could be the basis of the entire talk. And I think each of these questions and issues, I think, are things that I think about. I think, as I was saying, as in the work that I do, and they're also some of the issues and questions that I think I faced when I was a graduate student myself. And so I'm going to take you back in what I speak to you about to when I was doing my PhD and trying to think about how to approach the methodological side of my own research, including the work that I did for my dissertation. What now feels like ages ago, but I hope you will concede that it's not that far into the past. And so some of these issues, I think, and I want to just put them on the table to begin, are so for all of the critiques that we hear of publish or perish culture in academia, the pressures to publish continue to keep growing. Again, for all of the critiques and the counter movements that have been trying to push against it, the importance of accumulating citations or otherwise rising according to various citation metrics also continues to persist. Not unrelated to both of those previous points, sort of disciplinary posturing, right, or positioning. So some staking your ground within, like, this is the field or this is the discipline that I'm a part of, or defending that discipline or field vis-a-vis other aspects or other corners of the university or other researchers, continues to play a very important role of determining who and how, sort of what topics or what and how you approach scholarship. And again, not unrelated to all of those topics, these things are obviously all very interconnected. The journals that you are kind of pressured to publish, and I think pressured in the worst of cases or nudged towards in the best of cases, because they are how you manage to accumulate and garner sort of a standing in your field, end up predetermining sometimes the questions and methods that you use. And so some of what I want to speak to you today it has been my sort of personal approach to sort of tackling and facing these issues, not just in the research that I do, but in the kind of scholar or the kind of work that I've this kind of scholar that I've tried to become, and the kind of approaches that I take in my own work. And so as I was saying, we could go into a whole bunch of details, and I'd welcome many questions around, or any number of questions around any of those issues or topics, like I was saying, that I really spend all my time thinking about. What I want to do is spend sort of the remaining time that I have with you today to sort of walk you through how, on sort of a few different occasions, and I'll just going to point to a couple of my own examples of my own work, to try to use what I consider to be kind of the simple methods to shed light onto interesting questions in innovative ways. And in that way, try to position myself as a scholar by thinking about what are those questions that are important to me, and not by trying to make my methods overly complex. I think this has allowed me, and I use all of this, so if it resonates with you, to think about it in your own work. It has allowed me to not sort of get caught up in some of those disciplinary struggles that exist and field posturing that we kind of come across. And also to not find myself cranking out what I consider to be kind of like meaningless publications that are just done for the purposes of playing the game, or just doing scholarship for the sake of doing scholarship or doing it as a career. I hope some parts of this sort of trajectory and this story will resonate, and hopefully will serve you well as you proceed, I think, in your own academic careers and whatever it is that you will do. I did prepare a few slides, so let me just see if I can manage to share this with you. And so just give me 1 second here. Let me just get the PowerPoint show going and see if I can, just 1 second. So I'm going to see if I can do this and also keep my notes going at the same time. Just should have. Where did Zoom go? Okay, let me just confirm that you can see a picture of me sitting on my desk as a graduate student. Can I just get, Phillips, can I just get a thumbs up from you if you can see that? Because I can see you on my screen. Great, great. So as I was saying, my story begins here when I was a doctoral student. And so this is me sitting on my desk in a posture that you might, looking confused, trying to read some academic papers with a stack of books that I did, underneath my laptop. And I've been working in Latin America and trying to understand Latin American scholarly publishing for some time. I sort of came into doing my graduate degree after having done some work already in this space for a few years, finding myself asking questions and wanting to know more, and deciding that a graduate degree was a way to try to better understand and explore these questions. I knew already when I started my PhD that I wanted to do a dissertation on this topic of Latin American scholarly publishing, which is primarily all open access publishing. And so I had already worked with three of the major players in the region, Latindex, Redolix, Cielo, three major regional scholarly portals that combined, they had a directory of thousands of journals published in the region, the metadata for articles from 1,300 or more than 1,300 journals, the download data for all of every research article published by these 1,300 plus journals. And I could ask like citation data around how many times these things had been cited for a whole bunch of those journals, not for all, but for most. And I had the distinct advantage of coming into my graduate degree with a computer science background, which meant that I possessed the computational skills to be able to sort of crunch this data. I did my undergrad in computer science at Waterloo, where it was part of a mathematics degree. So I had the mathematics knowledge to be able to understand, even if I had not yet learned all of the sophisticated kind of statistical methods to crunch this data. And so while I was doing my PhD in the School of Education, my own background in terms of having these computational and mathematical skills, the access to data, were very much seen as both by my colleagues and by my professors as sort of an advantage, a competitive advantage that I had over all of these other education scholars. It became clear to me that I should probably deepen, or like it was sort of like the system kind of guided me towards trying to say deepen my methodological expertise so that I could use it to differentiate myself from the other scholarship that was happening around me. I sort of saw that like, and I was sort of, this is my guidance from faculty members, and again, from the system itself, was sort of that I could succeed by further distinguishing myself from all of my colleagues on these grounds. And so I sort of set about as part of my graduate training to do this. I took classes in network analysis so that I could say use this data and create networks, and learned how to do it took me several weeks to sort of just part of the class, and then how to run packages on doing random graph models. So essentially the ability to be able to compare networks to see if it's kind of the equivalent of comparing it to a normal curve, right? So you want to test the null hypothesis if the network you're seeing differs from one that could be randomly generated, and learning the software packages to be able to run these things. And I wanted to see, maybe I can use this to figure out if the scholarship in Latin America was more national or more regional or more international than scholarship in other parts of the world. So I sort of went down that rabbit hole for some time. I also took classes on natural language processing, and I figured, okay, well, this is another sort of set of tools and computational methods that I can use. So I figured I would, learn how to do labeled topic modeling and sort of using labeled and unlabeled methods for topic modeling, supervised and unsupervised learning. I sort of learned a whole complicated suite of methods to figure out which articles clustered together, so that so I could figure out if the scholarship in Latin America was engaging with itself, and sort of which fields were talking to each other, and the kinds of sophisticated things that we might be able to do. And I sort of bring this up to sort of say, like, I knew I had this very unique data set, right? I had a massively understudied problem space of Latin American scholarly publishing, so there's very little scholarship done in the area. And all of this data and all of these skills and the ability to sort of learn and take on these complex methods. I really struggled to figure out how it is that I should try to apply all of these methods and what I wanted to do. What I really wanted to know was, what is the value of the way that scholarship is being done in Latin America, right? Like, what is happening around this open access model? And so I kept trying to find clever statistical, computational, quasi-experimental ways to answer the question of, like, who's using this stuff, and how are Latin American scholars themselves using these things? And that's when, after, I think, and struggling on what I was wanting to convey to you here, is that as you find yourself thinking about what methods you want to employ, as you sort of struggle to think through how you should methodologically approach your question, I sort of realized that what I really wanted to do is if I want to know who is using this stuff, that I should maybe just ask them. And I should just go with something very simple. And so this is one of the portals. This is the portal of Cielo Brazil. And what I did is when someone was downloading an article, I thought that the best way of knowing who's using this stuff, instead of trying to crunch all this data and do all of this, math and complex methods, I would just pop up a little pop-up survey that asked people questions. And I just asked 3 different questions. And one of them was, I work in, and I got people to ask. A different question was, I'm interested in this research because, and I asked them with a series of options. It's a very simple poll that allowed me to give, to get a very direct answer to what was my actual question without needing to go into the unique sort of underlying data that I had or going into any complicated methods. And you might sort of gave me a chance to then get to see, and this is sort of like probably the core finding of my dissertation. And what you can see here is that all we're seeing is some very straightforward percentage breakdowns of who's accessing articles. There's obviously in the dissertation, there's a whole bunch of extra things that are there, but these are the numbers that I come back to sort of again and again, seeing where the people are coming from, where they work, seeing the reasons they're interested in the article. There's no statistical tests that are done. It is really just percentage breakdown. And you might say, well, this particular solution sort of worked. I was able to gain access to the people that I was really interested in because I had access to this portal. But later on as I was going through my dissertation, I came across the same problem as I was trying to make the argument that social media might be a place where we might be able to understand if the public is using this research and who from outside of academia is using this work. And so, as lots of people have tried to answer this question since looking at social media. This was very much in the early days of what is now known as altmetrics. But when I wanting to sort of know if anyone in the public is sharing research on social media, I had just come off this high of having done this very simple intervention of just getting a very quick answer or response. And so I thought, how could I do that on social media? Instead of trying to crunch the numbers and analyze, people have, analyzing bios, looking at lists, all kinds of methods that people have done since to understand. I came up with, well, let me just do the exact same thing again. I wrote a little Twitter bot that whenever a research article was shared, I would just tweet at them in an automated way with my academic or not research bot. That all it said, I would ask them, you just shared research, would you mind telling me if you're affiliated with a university? And I would, at them and ask them that question. And this sort of gave me the, astounding result. In the cases of Cielo Brazil, I was able to find that 36% of the people that had tweeted research were not affiliated with universities. They were affiliated with other kinds of institutions. There was sort of some interesting people doing sort of like, science podcasts who were sharing research on social media. And this is sort of interesting things to be able to find in ways that would not have been possible if I'd just been trying to look at just the data in more sophisticated ways. I want to go beyond social media and beyond the scholarly communication research side of things and say that for those of you that are maybe more from the library side and interested in documents and text corpora, I would say that some of those issues that I was mentioning earlier that happen in academia, often I find that those conversations end up kept coming back to the incentive structures sort of in academia guiding people towards those goals. And so people kept saying, well, if review tenure and promotion guidelines didn't incentivize doing things in a particular way, we wouldn't be having some of those issues. And so what we, I even saw proposals for a campaign to try to change the way the review tenure and promotion was done. And I thought, well, first of all, don't we need to know to what extent those review tenure and promotion guidelines are actually asking faculty to do some of these things? And so here we came up with a study to just say, well, let's just collect a whole bunch of those documents and and take a look at them. And so what we did is just collect hundreds. And how do we collect them? We just emailed people and asked them for the documents. Again, not a complex sort of survey, not trying to analyze people's career trajectories. Just email people, ask for documents, and again, looking at very simple percentage breakdowns of which concepts or terms were found within those documents, the review, tenure, and promotion guidelines that guide faculty work. And there we could very plainly and directly see how metrics are very prevalent, especially at research institutions, and that terms like open access are almost not present at all, right? And so we, again, very simple method. There's nothing much simpler than just looking at a document and saying, does it say this thing? Does it not say this? Does it not say this thing? Is it mentioned? Is it not mentioned? No need to go into much further detail. And so what I want to sort of emphasize with these documents is that I have sort of accidentally become one of those scholars who becomes known for doing somewhat innovative methods. But I don't think that any of these things, that these sort of three examples that I've just showed you, are really that innovative at all. There's some real clever studies out there that do some like clever and sophisticated methods to try to do work. And I admire that, and I don't want to, if that's the kind of thing that you're really interested in doing, then by all means. But what I wanted to sort of point out and emphasize in my little talk today is that I don't think that we don't need to necessarily go to those questions in order to be able to become a good scholar. Innovative methods might sometimes just come not because by trying to apply something that's very simple to a more interesting question. Some of these pop-up surveys already existed. Twitter bots, and they're used all the time in web stuff. Twitter bots obviously already existed. Checking if a term is present or not is something that, again, very simple analysis, as you can imagine. So why is it that these papers and studies that I've done have become successful? Why do I and why do others consider them to be interesting methods? I think that it's because they ask questions that a lot of people, and not just a select few within a narrow band of a discipline, really want to know the answers to. I really care about the so what when I ask these questions. And so, and I think that other people do. And so when you do that, when you really care about the so what, it frees you from having to come up with the perfect answer. Because if the answer is important, having a complete answer doesn't become as essential. That is, instead of trying to answer a boring question in a clever way, I think it's always better to try to answer an interesting question in a very boring way. So ask a good question and look for a good enough way to approximate the answer. And if your question is good enough, then the perfect answer is really not something that you need. Going back to sort of that earliest example, right? Like of the pop-up survey, did my method control for all of the demographic characteristics of the people? No. Could I have tried to get multiple answers and link them together to form a more complete picture of what users in Latin America are doing? Sure. I could have linked those answers to those Erdos-Raini models, the random graph models. Sure, you could do that. But at the end of the day, the most compelling thing to come out of my PhD, and I think one of the most compelling findings that I've had in my work so far, is that when you ask people if you're interested in this research, that you get that professional and personal use was 1/4 of the downloads. And it's a very incomplete, it's a very imperfect answer. But as it turned out, it's also a very innovative way to answer a very simple question that a lot of people, everyone in the open access movement, really care about. So just to conclude, by all means, come up with clever studies, think through all of the interesting angles that you can, make your studies as robust as you can, and do high quality work. This is all absolutely essential. But my advice and the final thoughts here today is that first spend time thinking about your questions that you really care about, and the so what of those questions. And what is it that you really want to understand and why you care about them. Only after you have done that should you figure out how innovative a method you really need to be able to answer that question. it might turn out, like in all of these examples I've given you, that the most innovative thing that you can do is sort of just answer the question in a very simple way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Aprin, for that interesting presentation on methods. So, okay, we have a couple of hands. Simad, you can ask a question.
Yes, hello, Prof. Alperin. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. My question is, since we do not have access to the total population and that we cannot control for socio-demographic variables, what are some things that we can do to improve the generalization of these types of pop-up surveys?
Yeah, so, you know, it always depends on what it is that you are, this is why it matters what your question is, right? So there are some questions, and this is where the complicated methods sometimes come in as you're trying to get the nuance of your question starts becoming more important. In the case that like in my own case, what I wanted to know is who is this audience? It becomes, I think a lot of people would get caught up. And in fact, I had people on my own dissertation committee ask me questions similar to that, wanting to know, you know, well, how does this relate to the overall population? And for me, it's like, this is not the population I thought was important for this particular question, is the population of people who access the articles. In that sense, there is no demographic consideration because I do have the whole population. The population is the people that are reading this. Your questions then, I guess, is asking, well, how does this relate to the general population? How does that breakdown go? And those are the kinds of, that, for me, when you start, a lot of people start going down that road of like, how do I make my method more robust? And how do I start to then have all of the comparables? A little bit what I'm arguing for is not to say that you should never do that, but that it's wrong to always try to answer or go to that place first, because there was a very simple, basic question that was unanswered here. And that getting an approximation of just getting a better sense of asking what is already an interesting question in and of itself can lead you to consider an approach that might be discarded by others. I don't know, maybe that's not a very satisfying answer because I'm not giving you methodologically how do you control it. It would be very specific to the kind of problem and question that you have. Well, what I want to say in my case is that for my question, like I was able to discard that. And the other part I was able to discard was there was a lot of questions around how does this relate to other parts of the world that are not open access? Like, well, shouldn't you could do a comparative study that compares Latin America's open access to North America's closed access? And again, it's people want to go to those, that's methodologically, it's more sound, it's more robust, but you are overcomplicating what I think fundamentally can be you can ask a more straightforward question, and that can be more interesting than going on the complexity of the more robust methods.
Thank you. I think it's kind of like a reflex that as researchers, we always try to fall on. So how is this relevant in a statistical way? But you are right, like not every single question needs to be this robust on a statistical point of view, I think.
Yeah, and that's precisely, so I think the main message I was trying to get across is to not, like, I think the pressures of like how we do research and saying of like we get trained in doing this methodological complexity and sophistication. And I wanted to try to use this time to help free you of that. Because if you have a good question underneath, getting an approximate answer that might not paint all of the corners of how it fits in, it might not position your answer perfectly, might still actually, that might be the interesting thing, the more interesting thing to do. And it's a worthwhile endeavor. And I've almost done so much of my work since, and if you look at other things I've published in, is often discarding some of that complexity for the sake of answering something that I can also explain very simply to someone, and saying like your message can resonate more when you can, when your question is one that's really worth asking.
Thank you. So Alamir, you can ask the question.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I think that I also intuitively somewhat used some of that method of just asking with some of my experiments where there were certain demographic questions I had, and I was just like, well, why don't I just ask the participants? So I have a technical question that then leads to a more general one. So when you did the naive Bayes classifier, you ended up dropping the denominator. And I was wondering if, other than just simplifying the naive Bayes classifier, do you feel like there's a relationship between that and asking a question, because you're sort of relying this is like a general question, but there might be not an answer, but I feel like there's a relationship between prior knowledge and just asking people questions. I was wondering if you saw a link there.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, what I put up as the slides from the random graph models and the NLP, I went back to I wanted to sort of show you that these are things I actually did as a graduate student. Those are just like lecture notes. Like just grabbed some random slides from the lecture notes from the classes that I took. In my dissertation, I did do some topic modeling. And to be honest, those results that I did for the topic modeling are in the dissertation, and I've never talked about them again. But the only bits of, there's a whole bunch of additional analysis I do in my dissertation, because a dissertation sort of warrants the exploration of every angle that you can think of or that you have access to. And so I did do other things so I did some of that sort of topic modeling and sort of trying to cluster the answers for those, what is the public interested in? What are the topics that the public is interested in versus the topics that the researchers are interested in? All of that stuff, I have literally never published it anywhere else. I've never given a talk on it anywhere else. I don't even ever bring it up, because the interesting part, and so I did all of this other sophisticated, I learned how to do these sophisticated complex methods, and it's worthwhile learning to do them and having those in your back pocket. At the end of the day, I think that the interesting aspect and the part that people found most compelling of my work was this very simple way of approaching the problem and getting the broad scale demographics of the audience. And that's and I think even more so with the Twitter bots. The Twitter bots, people were very I've got lots of questions, and people finding that to be a very sort of innovative method. But it's kind of clever, but it's very straightforward. It's like, okay, well, let's just what is the simplest way I can answer this question of who is the audience? And it's like, you just ask everyone in the audience, and then you can get an answer. And so that's a little bit where I was going. So we can go into the details of the topic modeling and so on. And if you're here in BC, so it's easy to coordinate in time. Feel free to reach out. I'm happy to talk to you about what I know about those things.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So we just quickly take our last question for this morning, and there's Philip.
Hi, Juan Pablo. Thanks for the presentation. That was very interesting, and I just want to say I totally am sensitive to your point, and it's true that sometimes the simplest methods are the most effective ones to answer the question that you're asking, and also to communicate, your findings to the public. Because if nobody understands your method or what you actually did, then it just can also hinder the transmission of knowledge. And so it's a good, I think, message for pragmatically answering the question that you're trying to answer and succeed in your PhD. For some people that want to avoid the arduous path that you've taken, but now you're just don't go there, guys. It's not necessary. So I appreciate the message of that, and yeah, I agree. And I just wanted to sort of ask you, or maybe it's more like a comment, I guess. But sometimes I think the real issue with the complex method is that we seem to, when we don't understand something, we just assume that it's awesome, right? It's kind of this human bias that we have, like, oh, it's complicated, it's great, right? So I wonder to some extent if you've seen, or if you noticed, or if you ever thought of the real problem being when we think that a certain research or a certain thing is valuable or providing answers to the question because they are using complex method, when in fact it's the opposite. Like the method was not necessarily appropriate for the question, and then it was used because of its complexity, which gives an appearance of validity, when in fact, if you understand what's happening, you can actually say, well, that doesn't work. And so there's this challenge of complexity that sorts of maybe, you know, it's wrong on two sides. I don't know if you, I think, yeah.
I think, yeah, no, I think that resonates. There's a simplicity to it, and this is maybe betrays the way that I approach when I give talks and when I do my work. Right? I'm hiding complexity in presenting forward a simple message or simple takeaway. I'm hiding the complexity of the thinking that goes into when I choose to apply even the simplest methods. Like there is a complexity of thinking and understanding what are the possible things that you could do. How complex could this be? And I think that it's about knowing and understanding how complex does your method need to be, right? And what is too complex to really answer the core question that you want. And there's always, I think, a constant conversation that happens within my teams and internally in my mind around, am I asking this question? Am I asking something that's too basic and we won't learn that much from? So do I need to make my question more sophisticated? And then that might require the method to also escalate in complexity. But it's about lining up the complexity of your question with the complexity of the method. And it's just like when students ask me, how long should my essay be, right? How long? And I say, it needs to be as long as it needs to be to do what you are trying to do. And then the complexity of the method needs to be as complex as it needs to be, but no more complex and no less complex. And finding that balance takes skills and experience to be able to figure that out. I also think you need to know how to do how to make your methods more complex. What are the options? You need to kind of think about what are the possibilities, what are the other considerations, so that you can decide if you need to go to that extra layer of complexity or not. And so finding that balance, but I think a lot of people end up overcompensating on complexity of methods because they are unsure of the significance of their question. And so they tried to say like, well, if I go on complexity of method, people will understand that this is a very complicated problem. And so that's a little bit what I'm trying to caution against, is guarding against an insecurity of your question by overcompensating with a more sophisticated method.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Philip.